Meeting with the EDC and the RFP as well, in attendance for July 29th. Please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Tonight's Board of Selectmen agenda. We have invited guests, as I mentioned, the two committees, EDC and the RFP. We'll discuss the town center vision. Then we'll move on to discussion items 4.0, execute the statement of claim for 92 Hopkinton Road, approve the Red Rock Road Race. We also are going to open the warrant for the fall special town meeting. And we are skipping over 4.4 on the discussion items. So that will be it for this evening. So I think what we should start, we have a lot of new faces. Obviously, a new committee was just formed, so I think it'd be helpful for us to go around the room and introduce ourselves, and you can identify which committee that you are serving on. So I guess I'll start. Stephen Metellian, Board of Selectmen.
Brett Simons, Board of Selectmen.
Dave Ross, EDC and the Chairman of the RFP Committee.
Tony Castellana, RFP.
Steve Johnson, RFP.
Kelly Pollard, Clerk on the RFP Committee.
Catherine Worsham, RFP Committee.
Craig Weinfuss, RFP Committee.
Carolyn Howard, Top Rock, Assistant to the Town Manager, Staff Support.
Michelle Antarelli, EDC.
Steve Rackerton, EDC.
Gene Burnett, Chair of EDC.
Sandy Hackler, Executive Assistant.
Okay, and then for some discussion items that I had drafted up, I'm not sure, Brett, if you have some as well, but I thought that we talk about kind of the scope of the project, trying to stay within the boundaries, so to say, of what the Board of Selectmen actually have the ability to sell or convey. Talk about the timeline. I'll have maybe Derek talk a little bit about that. Timeline, the RFP process. There was also an idea of maybe an RFQ, so maybe we could talk a little bit about that. And then maybe a quick discussion about the church. It would be nice if we could, preserve that and repurpose that, kind of preserve the old New England charm of our downtown. And then any other questions that may arise, questions that you folks may have for the Board of Selectmen or you may have for one another. Brett, I'll toss it over to you. Is there anything that you would like to cover that I haven't mentioned?
No, I think we should just be clear about the expectations and what the RFP committee sees their charter as, and make sure that we're all on the same page with sort of what that process looks like, how we think it's going to run or should run, who's driving it, what's the timeline, what role do you need the board to play, those kinds of things. That's all I've had.
Right. And I think where that stems from is there's a lot of ideas, obviously a lot of moving parts to the project, but the board only has the ability to sell or convey 3 Milford Street and the parking lot, which is number 6, I believe it is, Grove Street. So, we can't involve any other parcels at this time. There's also ideas, obviously, we had the meeting on the 25th, back I think that was June 25th, with some state representatives, employees of the state, talking about Grove Street, whether or not that can be moved. But I think that's certainly a project for down the road. So in the short run, we do need to kind of stay on topic as far as, the actual, those parcels that I had mentioned previously. So, I understand there was a meeting last week, was it?
Yes. Yeah, we met last Monday.
Okay. Is there anything that came out of that you'd like to kind of bring the board up to speed on?
Well, we organized as a committee and got that out of the way. And we discussed that the RFP committee is going to be focused really on 3 pieces for the RFP. So the first piece is defining the design standards, which is going to be the look and feel of the downtown. And during the working group visioning process, there was a Saturday session where people were invited and you could put red or green dots on different looks and feels of the buildings. So we have all that information. We have to find a way to put that into words so people understand what that is. And so, in essence, telling the contractors what we want built as a town. We also then have to work on what our criteria is going to be for having a successful bidder. So do we determine that saving the church or including the church is number one? Green space, walkability, different things like that for that parcel of area on that. Those being the two main areas to focus on. And then the third one is we have a couple sample RFPs which have a lot of the legalese and information we need to provide, which, Derek as the procurement officer will be very helpful in completing that work. So we left with our homework as a committee for everybody to review some samples we have of design standards, to make sure we review the vision report. And also there was a RFP that we were able to get from CMRPC that Rutland did as an example. So everybody's reviewing that information over the last week and this week. We meet again next week. We're kind of going to look at that point to do maybe little subcommittees for people that want to work on those different phases of it. And I think we all understand that we're really just talking about these parcels right over here. If anybody feels differently, feel free to say that. But so that was kind of how our first meeting went.
Okay. Was there anything, say, for design standards, is there any one thing that really was clearly that was shining through through the working group process?
Actually, in the report that Dodson did, they defined the design standards that people wanted to see. It's a very detailed report that goes into all of the intricacies of, how many floors, what the feel in front of the buildings would look like, the configuration of those buildings, and that kind of thing. I do think that for a point of clarification, there's a little bit of discussion that's required regarding what the role of the RFP committee is relative to the town vision that was voted on, the town center vision that was voted on at town meeting, and what the enabling steps are for the RFP committee to be successful in their work. They can't go out to bid without zoning changes. Otherwise, it's a fool's errand. Basically, there's nothing that would allow under the current zoning for the vision to be built. So the EDC is parallel tracking a zoning change initiative that will cover both the area in question where the RFP committee is concerned and those town-owned properties, and the surrounding properties in a village zone that's consistent with the vision that was voted on. So there is discussion about what the extent of that zone would be, but in order for all of these things to occur, in order for the vision to be implemented, zoning changes are required that foster the vision itself, which is, retail on the bottom floor, residential on the top floor, and that would apply to an area from, say, the Country Super to some point along 140 going towards the Rose Garden. If we don't do that, none of the work will matter. We'll create spot zoning for 3 buildings without addressing the reason for the town center becoming decrepit over time. So we have to build value through zoning. Building that value is a critical step to seeing a vision through for the next 30 to 50 years. So that's 2 separate things, and it really needs to be clearly understood by both residents and the members of the various committees that, they're not the same thing. So what RFP committee is doing is not what EDC is doing in furthering the goals of the vision statement.
And we as a committee realize we do not have the time to also tackle zoning.
Right.
The EDC tackling that is fine while we work on, Because as Gene said, zoning is bigger than those 4 parcels.
However, the design standards that were referred to, those design standards encompass this whole area. And that's what the town meeting was voting on, was what all the workshops were on, was the entire downtown area and what people wanted to see. So the design standards that are put into place for these 3 buildings or these 3 parcels would also be used and be the fundamental underpinning of design standards that would go into the zone, whatever that zone may be called or however it's configured. You know, there are 2 options for us. One is through a state mandate or a state approved 40R zone. The other is through our own zoning that we create for ourselves, whatever if we want to call it, the village center zone. So those things are all going to be parallel tracked at the same time.
I think we're going to use the vision as a springboard for the RFP.
Exactly.
We're also going to presume that the zoning is going to be changed so that we can move, the RFP will presume that that's going to be done.
I mean, as I look at downtown, and I actually spent a little bit of time today reading through some of the Dotson and Flinker report, and I was really focusing in on the zoning. And it's funny the way the zoning line is drawn. We have a lot of mixed-use property all along Route 140, although the zoning doesn't state that as such. So, but if you start, even back around the corner a little bit here, and you look at, say, the hair salon, and you come to Fin and Feather, you look at the pizza shop, there's apartments upstairs there. You look at the record shop and I forget what the other store is across the street, but of course there's apartments above there. And as you keep going down, Country Super, same thing, there's apartments above that. So there's mixed use. It's been going on for, I don't know how long before, I guess before my time anyways. So, and then when you look at the actual zoning that they identified in the report, it's very narrow. In fact, I think the line is actually in front of this building, in front of the town hall. So I think if we're going to, from my perspective, and I'll let Brett chime in afterwards or speak to it afterwards, but from my perspective, we need to kind of take all of that in. So if we're going to do a zoning change, we want to, we want to reach farther down 140, as opposed, I'm not in favor of saying, okay, well, let's just do it for 7 buildings or 7 parcels or 11 parcels. If we have that going on, and I think back a few years back, you look at when I was a kid, it was the hardware store, which is, at the corner of Warren Street and Route 140. So that's a parcel there. Again, it was a hardware store when I was a kid, and next door was a lumber store. So there's been businesses up and down 140 all through time. So is this an opportunity, especially to give the EDC, I don't want to say ammunition, but to give you some something to really attract business to town, is to give you a broader scope of a business center. So is this a time where maybe we look at it and say, well, let's go all the way down 140, or at least go to whatever that number is in the street?
I think what we have to deal with, and what we're trying to use as our guiding document, is, the town center vision that was voted on. Because, changing zoning is a heavy lift. It's a 2/3 majority vote at town meeting. It requires a lot of education. It requires a lot of promotion of the concept. And we've done a great deal of that work already. So it would be a shame to waste all the momentum we've built in building consensus around a vision and not take advantage of it and have it be reflected in the zoning. Just as you're pointing out, these uses are grandfathered, but if anybody else wanted to come in and do it, they're banned from doing it because it's not allowed.
Right.
So our goal is to create zoning that is consistent with the vision, and also to create it in a way that, in my opinion, that's kind of like a by right zoning, that these things are assumed to be approved unless otherwise, if some other consideration is involved. I think, what we have right now is a situation where it ties the hands of any developer or even the town itself in trying to move towards a vibrant town center. So we have to do everything we can at this time to do all of, put all the tools in the toolbox. So.
Right.
So I guess a couple of points on that. One is about sort of the zoning along 140. I agree. I think we need to parse this off and not overreach with whatever zoning proposals we come up with. Because to your point, we're going to be hard pressed to get people to approve any zoning changes, particularly for the downtown area. And it makes me wonder if we should do something in the short run, have a sort of short and medium term goal where, for the sake of getting this transaction done and these two parcels done, you know, almost like a spot plus plan, where we're going to do spot zoning for just these parcels. This is phase 1 of our 20 to 30 year vision. If we get that set up, we can go to the, you know, fall town meeting with the zoning change that's for just these parcels, with the proposal for, with the response for the RFP and whatever that's going to cost ideally. And then in the spring, we come out and say, hey, here's the village zoning, but separate that from really what we're calling phase 1 of the project. Totally defer to you guys, but that's something that I would think about, because to your point, you know, there's going to be a lot of debate about how far to extend that village district and what parcels does it include, because obviously the landowners are going to want it to include their parcels, and is it by right or have to go through the planning board? Excuse me. So, you know, I think those are all questions to think about, but what I would recommend we minimize are any blockers to realizing what we would call phase 1 of the vision, which is to manage and work with the two parcels that right now are the focus, the most narrow focus of what that vision was.
So the other thing to consider too is the way that we've been discussing zoning is by proposing an overlay, not changing the existing zone. So an overlay means that whatever the zoning was there before, which is mostly general business, stays in place, and you now have, property owners have more flexibility, not less. So if we can get people to understand that concept, it basically says, look, you're getting more flexibility, you're not losing anything. It would seem to me that that would be an easier sell than trying to change the underlying zoning, which means everybody has to change.
Great.
So by doing the overlay, it allows us to encompass more stuff, more properties, and have, you know, be able to make the argument that this gives you more flexibility, not less.
No, absolutely, and I think the point I was making was around the abutters, right? So that next lot over from wherever you draw that line, those people are going to say, well, why don't you include my lot, right? Because the people in the zone are getting more value. The people just on the edge of that zone are losing that overlay advantage. So again, it's just, those are the kind of semantics you run the risk of getting into, the more you reach with whatever zoning proposal you have.
So we had that discussion at our meeting last week, exactly this discussion. And, you know, there's a strong reason to define the boundaries at a little bit greater extent than what we're talking about. But we decided that, you know, to your point, you know, and Steve's point, the general business zone kind of goes out towards Gasco and that area there. So what we tried to say, okay, if we just include, basically look at just the general business zone, where that's approved, and try to do the mixed-use zoning there, that's probably the easiest lift. If we try to expand too far, if we go too far down towards West Upton, that's going to be a problem. If we go too far towards East Upton, that's going to be a problem. So I think we have to clearly define our rationale and explain our rationale for where we draw the boundaries. But you know, every time so let's say we do phase 1, phase 2, the problem that we have with doing a phase 1, phase 2 is phase 2 has to go to town meeting too. Mm-hmm. So every time you have a 2/3 town meeting vote and you build one on top of another, your risk of implementation goes way down. Mm-hmm. So our thought is that we spend the time, we do the education that's necessary, we do the outreach that's necessary, continuing the process that we started. With the town, the town center visioning, and just, keep it narrowly focused, but keep our rationale, very clear.
I think it's a great point to just use the existing general business, because those are folks that already have that value, and the people on the edge of that already have an expectation of our zone is different than the lot next to us. So that's a perfect rationale to use. Talk to me a little bit about the process and timing, right? Because I'm thinking it's a heavier lift to get more zoning passed, because you need to get more support, but what's the timing look like over the next 6 months? Because if the RFP committee is dependent on zoning changes, I mean, are those things we expect to happen in concert, to Steve's point, where the RFP committee just assumes that that's going to get approved in the fall town meeting, or do they have to wait for the fall town meeting to finalize their selection, or how do we think that's going to work?
I
think that basically our goal is to have zoning prepared, for fall town meeting. All of our schedules are predicated on meetings with the planning board, the dates of the warrant, all of those things. So, it's going to be tough. There's no question about it, it's going to be tough, but we think we can get there. The RFP committee, on the other hand, thinks it's going to, most likely it won't be ready to go out with an RFP until sometime really first of the year, next year.
That's what we're thinking, probably.
Yeah, so we may have two town meeting cycles that we can get through, but our goal is to get through the first, is to try to get the zoning to the
Get
first.
the zoning in the fall, and then ideally have something in the spring
Exactly.
on the actual plan.
You say it's a heavy lift, is it because of the boundary issue, where you draw the line?
I think the heavy lift is that, the last time this happened, it was such a fiasco. When the village zone was proposed, there wasn't a lot of work that was done in educating people and, in people's property that were included that didn't know anything about what was going on. It was, it just didn't have the public process piece of it that was necessary to build a consensus. What I'm trying to do, what I think we should try to do is stick with what the town meeting voted on. And that in itself has a defined boundary. So that's what we're trying to just say. This is what everybody wanted to see in this particular area. That's the boundary for the zoning. Rather than say, okay, we're going to extend it everywhere. It's just those areas.
I think my only concern was, as you look down 140 a little bit, is this a good time to include, say, the country super, for instance?
Yeah, I think it
Does
is.
that parcel, maybe the one next door, how far, that'll be,
I think it's the
a point
existing general business zone is what they're saying,
Yeah.
right?
Or a pre-existing,
Those
They're
aren't,
not-
Yeah, those aren't in
It's
it.
not, the
Yeah.
general business.
but
zone
they are a
doesn't go down
pre-existing
there.
use. So the way we looked at it and discussed again on Wednesday, it's a pre-existing use that's consistent with the general business. So you have Mike Moran's garage, you have Country Super, the barber shop, the tattoo shop across the way. It's natural to say, maybe that's not general business, but it's natural to say those particular parcels should be included.
So you would include those in the
Yeah,
overlay.
but that's where we drew the line.
Yeah.
that's what I mean, where those are just, right now, they're basically residential zones.
Yeah,
So
so
I think
you'd
it gives us a
include
chance.
those in the
Yeah,
overlay.
because they're already in that use.
Yeah.
That was the rationale, is they're in that use. We're not trying to change really anything there.
Starting with 6 Main Street, that's not SRA. All the way down to Sanborn's would be a good place to.
Which is Sanborn's?
Sanborn is the house that's right on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
Oh,
The greenhouse.
Recently,
For sale.
16 Main Street. So we talked about that too. We talked about whether whoever buys that property, it's likely it's going to be a knockdown.
Yeah.
And what would they propose to build there? Would they propose to build a residence or who knows what? I don't know how much further back they could
I
set.
think it's non-conforming for one thing.
Yeah.
It's not enough. So if you knock it down, you've got nothing but a help to beautify Upton.
Yeah.
It would probably be very difficult to ever reestablish that front line,
Yeah.
with regard to how close to the street that
Just to
is.
clarify for everybody, SRA is a zone within Upton, so single residence zone,
Single residence.
as opposed to the general business zone, right? So there's a general business
Yeah.
zone, SRA is a residential zone, and there's,
It should be mixed use.
yeah.
So to your point, though, in general, there's this fair amount of choreography that's necessary in all of this and coordination between various committees. I mean, our work, the EDC's work has to be the involvement of the various committees that would have opinions about these things, specifically the planning board, the ZBA, and get them included in the process early on. So our next meeting, planning board is invited to attend, so that we begin this process, explain the same rationale we're going through tonight, and then look at some of the alternatives, because many people aren't familiar with what a 40R zone is and the advantages that may offer the town in terms of state funding, as opposed to a locally driven zoning process. So both of the zones would be exactly the same. The language would be exactly the same in both of them. One carries state incentives with it, the other one doesn't, but it gives us maybe a little bit more local control. But the bylaws itself would look exactly the same.
I mean, I think one thing that we always hear is that I think people want more business in town. I mean, you hear it at town meeting, you hear it around, so I really don't think that we're gonna have a lot of opposition. You never know, but I don't think we'll have a lot of opposition as far as trying to expand, the ability for businesses to operate in the center of town. But, we shall see, I suppose.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, I have a different read on it, which is why there's two of us. I look at the master plan from 2005, the charter, the zoning that was put in place back in the 50s. I think there's a lot of desire for this to be and remain a bedroom community. I think there's a small contingent of people in the community that are very challenged by the tax rate. And I think that number increases every time we increase the tax rate, which is a real struggle and a real challenge. But I think the vast majority of people that live in this town don't want to see 140 turn into the next Route 9 or Route 20, right? I think they want it to be quiet. I think they want it to be small. I think they want it to be a bedroom community. I think they don't mind having to drive to Hopkinton or Whitensville to get their groceries. They don't mind if they got to go to Worcester to go to a nice restaurant or go to Alicante and Douglas. So I think that there is a balancing act that we need to play in order to get the support of people at town meeting and to make sure that we're as close as we can be to what the majority of people want in the town. That sometimes we have to think about the silent majority and not the vocal minority, and I think that this is one of those cases where, you hear a lot of feedback from a few people that say, we've got a 93% residential tax rate, we need more business, we need more business. Well, the reality is the businesses you're going to be able to attract to a town like Upton are few and far between unless you attract some big business on the outskirts of the town. You're not going to significantly impact the residential tax rate by getting mom and pop shops and small shops along 140 sporadically or even in a village district. That's not going to solve the problem that people express when they say our taxes are too high or we want more business in town. So we just have to be very realistic about what we can and can't do and what people do and don't want in the town. That's my opinion.
If you had 30 or 50 apartments on top of those businesses, now you're making a much bigger dent in the tax rate. So it's not the businesses that gives you a lot of the benefit on the tax rate. It's the apartments that are on top of those businesses that will generate a lot more tax revenue for the town than the businesses will. So the people that are challenged with property tax, we have to try to explain how doing this is in the long run going to help reduce that 93% number to a lower number. And
Yeah.
that's going to benefit them.
The other thing to keep in mind is, right, we're looking at, 144 units up on Upton Ridge, and potentially another, on Governor's Landing, there's a development that's in the works that could be another 200 plus units. So, we have to be aware that a lot of those people are coming. There's going to be a lot of people that can support some of these businesses, but these are all condos, townhouses, apartments that, depending upon their size, are going to bring children or not, but we need to be aware of that. I don't know that having a few apartments over these businesses is really going to significantly affect the tax rate, because the tax rate is a function not of the business revenue, right? It's the value of the property. So having people living above the store might help the store stay healthier longer, but it isn't necessarily going to help with the residential offset.
There's no question all of this has to be appropriate scale and appropriate for the town center. That's what the vision was all about.
Yeah.
We went through these various different scenarios. What was brought, what people came up with was a brew pub, an ice cream shop. These types of uses that are very attractive to the residents of the town that would be used by the locals, not necessarily to bring people in to shop, but just to be used by the community itself. I'm sure we'll bring people in if we do a good job of it. But the reason we would consider the 40R zone is that does come with state incentives, so that based upon the number of housing units, if we said the 40R zone extended from, this arbitrary lines that we're talking about, every new housing unit that's created has a state incentive payment. For every school child that comes in that has an increase in cost for the town, the state reimburses that difference in cost. It also allows us and puts us in priority for funding for road work, for a variety of other types of things. So like I said, there's a lot of different things that are moving pieces here. The primary driver wasn't to necessarily dramatically change the tax base of the community. The driver was to preserve the downtown and to make it more attractive and more useful to the residents.
And I think, I agree, and I think that's a really important message and focus for folks to have. I mean, certainly with the RFP committee, certainly with EDC, but also as we're talking about this with friends and family and neighbors and people in the community, to remind them of what the intent here is, what the problem we're solving is, what the vision is that they voted on. So that's a great reminder.
And to look at the rationale of our expanding the zone a little bit, there are some relatively large parcels that are right now zone general business across from the Rose Garden and Gasco and other, potentially other spots, that if we don't do what, put the design standards in place, put the zoning in place, there's nothing to prevent those being developed under the current zoning, which would allow a strip mall or something like that, which is not consistent with the vision that was voted on. So nobody really wants to see that, but that's what it's zoned for, and you get what you zone for. And we see that in East Upton, we see that in West Upton. So the zoning, although it had a tremendous amount of foresight back in the 40s and 50s when it was enacted, is obsolete for what we want to see in the town today. So we really need to be on top of the zoning is the critical issue here.
I think we also have to be careful when you talk about different parcels in town. If you talk about, say, Gasco, for instance, across the street from Gasco, that's kind of where I would like to see a strip mall. That's what I want to see on that location. I don't think I want to see mixed use at that particular spot. Again, if we are trying to, in fact, or at least I know I am, and Brett, you alluded to it, is we're sitting at that 93 to 95% residential tax burden. I think it's in fact, at our last recap sheet, I think it was closer to 95, so we're losing ground. So although it's nice to have apartments to offset, certainly makes it more profitable for a developer, if we're really looking to move the needle, we really need that component of commercial space.
Well, we need higher value. I mean, we need higher value business use. There's nothing to prevent it from being another, used car lot.
Mm-hmm.
There's, that's not going to increase value, but that's what it's zoned for right now. So, again, the design standards, what we're trying to come up with across the zone is to be consistent with preserving the village aesthetic that we all want to see. The goal of the business, we don't want to sacrifice anything in business square footage. Right? That's the other piece of this. So, as you said, the zone general business, because it has apartments over it, doesn't in any way decrease the amount of general business square footage, because our current zone is one floor, of general business, not 2 floors. So what we're doing is we're saying you got that general business as a foundation, and now you're stacking on top of it. So, however that mixed use gets implemented, whether it's over 55, whether it's assisted living, however it comes out, the goal will make the tax base, there's no question the result will be a healthier tax base, but to Brett's point, it's going to be incremental. It's not going to be dramatic. Whereas East Upton and what we want to do there in the overall business planning, other EDC work, that's much more where we're going to see the big impacts in terms of, commercial use, that higher value commercial use that support the tax base.
Right. Because the total value of the town is what the total value of the town is. Now, if you add a $5 million project,
Exactly.
you're moving the needle, but you're not really moving it an enormous amount, so to say.
Are you guys clear enough on sort of, I know there's, right, like the EDC, certainly with the zoning piece, right, like clearly EDC is going to own the zoning, RFP and the things you listed are squarely there. Are there any other things sort of at the nexus of the two committees where you need to do additional clarification on roles and sort of charter for one versus the other, or how does that work?
It really comes into planning board. I mean, we're right between, the RFP committee and the EDC and vision is planning board.
Yeah.
So planning board has to be we want to try and have planning board move in lockstep, got their valuable input into what they see as the potential problems with the zoning, but we can't do any of the zoning work until the RFP committee gets the design standards nailed. So job one for the RFP committee is the design standards.
Because
that gets incorporated
Then that
across
comes to
the
you
board.
guys and the planning board to.
Right,
I
exactly.
think the RFP committee's mandate, if you want to call it that, is only for the 4 parcels across here. It doesn't include way down
Right.
from Gasco and any of that stuff. And I was wondering if there's enough profit in that small development for a developer to do all the things we want him to do. One of the things we want him to clean up the Center Brook and do a lot of landscaping there. And I'm not sure if this contained small RFP that we're going to propose for those parcels is going to be enough for a developer to make enough profit on to do all the things we want him to do. Maybe.
But I mean, that's,
I'm talking about your quality or what was the word you used? The
Design
Aesthetics.
standards.
value, yeah.
right. So that's again why, it speaks again to why we want to expand the zone. Because the developer is going to put, in a sense, this gives them the opportunity to have a stake in the ground. I think the vision that we see that we were developing is that we get the kind of developer that makes an investment in the community that's, once they've learned the ropes, so to speak, and have a relationship in the community that's based upon our choosing them, that gives them a lot of reason to stay here and expand upon what they build. So we know there are other town-owned properties, the parking lot, for example, that were included in the vision that had mixed-use buildings in them. That's, maybe phase 2. And it gives stepping stones for a developer that sees the value in an expanded project. So again, what the RFP committee does with those 3 buildings lays the groundwork for everything that comes after. So they're not independent at all. They're tied, linked at the hip.
So the design standards get incorporated into the zoning changes,
Yeah, if you create an overlay district, that's where you can put the design standards in.
into that overlay district.
Yeah, which is appealing to a developer because then going in from the get-go, they know what's allowed and what's expected.
Yeah.
And it removes a lot of potentially back and forth on some of the plan reviews.
Right.
So-
Right, and it enables long-term investing, right? If you just do
Exactly.
spot zoning and someone says, okay, well, the project is the project, but if you do an overlay, they say, you know what, the project is the project, but then in another 20 or 30 years, if some parcel becomes available that's adjacent to my existing property, I know what I'll be able to do with it. And
Well,
so that's-
and we plan on the RFP at the beginning to give like an overview of the town and
Yeah.
then also the visioning,
Yeah,
without directly saying it, but kind of hinting at a developer, like,
Right.
it's only this part,
right,
but here's this big vision.
right, right.
So
It can
think
be a
ahead
long-term
that
investment,
maybe in
right.
2 or 3 years, if you build this correctly, this
Yeah.
is gonna be available and
Right,
stuff
these
like
other
that.
parcels can be, again, phase 2 or phase 3.
Exactly.
as we
But
move
then,
down the
yeah,
road.
but the RFP, so kind of work it down. Here's Upton, here's the vision, and now we're talking just this piece.
Yeah.
But hopefully
What's
they
the
can kind of be
downside
into
of an
this.
overlay? Why is there, you either have an overlay or you have,
The downside is that existing properties don't change. So you don't see improvement as quickly as you might if you change the general business zone to something different. So it doesn't force any change on existing property owners. It allows them to keep their property just the way it is.
so
If
the
they
overlay
want-
is either or, and mixed-use zoning would be a mixed-use zone.
So if we have an overlay and a property owner says, I would like to open a business on the first floor and rent out an apartment on the second floor, they could do that with the overlay. They can't do that with the existing general business zone.
No, not with the existing, but we're going to propose a mixed use.
That's what's in the overlay that we're proposing, is all kinds of
Okay.
mixed-use stuff.
So mixed-use zoning is an overlay.
No, the mixed-use zoning is what we're proposing to include in the overlay. The overlay doesn't have to be
Okay.
mixed use. We're choosing to do that because that's part of what the vision requires.
Right, you can put whatever zoning you want to in an overlay district, just depends on what your goals are for the district. So in this case, we're talking about making it a mixed use, right, by right, I believe,
Right.
and within the overlay.
Right, so for a good example, in, at the May town meeting, we approved an overlay district for marijuana. So, which is on the east side of town, so just that CNI district, we did an overlay just for marijuana.
So I think, just to clarify, the downside is gonna be on an individual property owner's homes. If now there's overlay, and next door where there's just a home, they can now put a business on the first floor, and that resident may not like that. So that's the lift, that's the sell, is you can keep your house the same, but by expanding and offering more flexibility to your neighbors on either side, you may not, as that property owner, like that.
Steve, didn't you say that an overlay was easier to get through the
Well,
town?
the issue with an overlay is if I'm a property owner in this area where it's gonna be zoned, if I'm happy with my house the way it is, I don't have to do anything.
Okay.
It doesn't affect me.
Well,
But if I'm, on the other hand, if I would like to do something different that I couldn't do under the current zoning, that now is a benefit to me. I can now rent out an apartment, or I can add an in-law apartment, or I can open a business on the ground floor and live upstairs. I couldn't do that before. So the benefit is it gives existing property owners more flexibility in what they can do with their property. And for those who don't want to do anything with their property, they're not affected.
But it does take the ability of the person, let's just say hypothetically, I'm your neighbor, and there's an overlay district. Now, all of a sudden, Steve is gonna have a tattoo shop in his first floor of his house. I no longer now, realistically, I cannot complain, or I'm
So
gonna have a
yeah,
very
if-
hard time stopping that action.
The issue always comes in on the boundary, where the zone ends. That's where the issue, whether it's an overlay or not, the issue is always going to be, if you're changing the zoning, the people who are on the boundary of that zone are going to be the ones who may complain. Because now something different can happen next door, and I can't do that, or I don't like what they could do.
We have a business district in West Upton that I think there's no businesses there. It's all residential, and they've recently built new residential. So, I mean, it sounds like if it's zone business, it's an easy proposition to.
Well, the reason they're building new residential is
Hold on
because
a
it's
second,
pre-existing.
'cause I'm
property.
not totally understanding his point. So can you finish what the point you're trying to make? Sorry to interrupt you, Steve, but.
Sounds like the overlay is either or. And if it's designated as a business, it only can be a business. But I think we have business in,
Through
maybe
special-
pre-existing.
No, through special permit. I mean, the planning
Yeah,
board
you get a
has
special
it, so
permit,
they get a
you can
special
build a new
permit.
house.
Right.
And that,
But so that's not going to be conducive to seeing the vision that was voted at town meeting be implemented. Because every time there's a change in the planning board, or a change in the, the community or the neighbors, then all of that is up in the air. What we want to do with all of this is create certainty. Nobody likes uncertainty. And every time someone has to go to the planning board or the ZBA to get a change of use is, in my mind, counterproductive to seeing the vision implemented. But make no mistake, everybody needs to understand, this is not easy. This is not easy. It's not going to be easy to get through town meeting. It's not going to be easy to explain to people. The more you talk about it and the more familiar you get with it, the better you'll be able to communicate the concepts to the people you talk to. So just like it was a fairly heavy lift to get to the vote in the spring, it's going to be the same this fall. So we can't lose anyone that we already captured. So the stick with what we got passed as a vision seems to me to be the guiding principle in all of this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, just for my 2 cents, like, talking is very important, and I think listening is as, if not more important. And we can talk afterwards, because maybe you guys know Steve well enough to know what his concern is, but I'm still not quite getting the point that you're trying to
Can
make. I
I-
know Steve's gonna try to summarize it, but I'd like you to summarize it, because everybody keeps interrupting you.
Well, I thought I was hearing that an overlay, you have more options.
Yeah.
But it sounds like if you just had a business district or a mixed-use district, you still have your options. You could have a residential exclusively residential
Yeah.
in a mixed use.
So you're questioning the value or why we would want to create an
Well, I'm trying
overlay
to
as
get to
opposed to
the-
just making it a mixed
The
use?
reason why a overlay would be the way to go.
As opposed to just making the zoning a
Mixed use.
mixed-use zoning, as opposed to what it is now, which is a general business zoning. So, right, so you're saying, why not just change the zoning for this area of the general business zone from general business to mixed use, and why doesn't that work as opposed to creating an overlay? Okay, so why would you add the overlay? Is that because you maintain the underlying zoning?
If it's because it's easier to get it passed in a town meeting, I can see that.
I'm not sure if it's easier, but I think, what you're doing with the overlay district is you're giving by right certainty. Right, so the business district, if we said the business district got turned into, the current residential district or whatever it is, got turned into general business, or mixed use, that's less encompassing than by right, a by right overlay. The by right overlay, outlines all of the potential uses. It doesn't limit it to, say, general business, where general businesses, as it's currently defined in Upton, is somewhat limited. And as in all zoning, if it's not listed as specifically listed in the zoning as an approved use, it's specifically prohibited. So we want to avoid that specifically prohibited aspect of the zoning, that, current zoning. Because, you can throw yourself on the...
Right off the bat.
What's that?
You don't want to restrict it too much right off the bat.
Right off the bat, right, exactly.
Does that make sense?
And I think just to throw out a little something on zoning, I think we ran into this with regard to the marijuana overlay district, which was the C&I district, which in the old days, what is now Mill House, the old hat factory, most of that's C&I. So that's your commercial, industrial, yet we have 50 to 75 houses built on those parcels, which ultimately you'd say it's the wrong zoning. It just doesn't make sense. Why would you have that much cluster, tight-knit housing in a C&I district in your town? So why it was done that way, unfortunately, I don't have that answer. Probably most of us don't, but it was just done that way. I do think that, that general business area, I do like the idea of expanding general business, but then again, maybe the overlay is the way to do it. Like I say, certain aspects, like I say, when you get down to that Gasco area and you get up into Route 140, I think that area of town, you'd want that to be strictly general business.
Right.
I think we had talked at one of our Board of Selectmen meetings, and up where my shop is, that parcel, that was all barren land on the north side of the road, and they built 10 or 12 houses. That would be probably 15, 18 years ago. They built all those houses, and that's general business up there. So that's a huge lost opportunity. You have all of 140, it's all businesses up there, but you ended up with 15 houses or so that were all built on them.
Which is why we want to, I think why this zoning change is critical, because as I said, when there are changes in the planning board or changes in the ZBA, everything becomes a special permit, and special permits are, how convincing are you today in terms of getting someone to buy your idea? We want to try and avoid that as much as possible. There should be a codified set of rules that get us where we want to go, that builds the aesthetic that we want, that's the small, the 2-story to 3-story maximum businesses, colonial front, small shop windows. That's, I think, what people voted for. That's what they went around the room in Town Hall down below here and put their dots on. This is what they wanted to see. So our mission is to see that's the bylaw, that's the overlay, that's what it describes, that's what the building standards and the design standards are specifically meant to do.
Have you had any discussion as far as, again, with the zoning, what percentage, you would want to see as far as commercial and residential? Would you look at that and say, okay, we're going to do it downstairs, upstairs, therefore it would be 50/50 is what we'd be looking for?
If we did a 40R, you know, and this is specific, you know, I did a 40R in Grafton on property that I owned, the commercial requirement was defined in the permit and the overlay. So there's an ability to do something like that in any of these, whether it's a local initiative, I think, or, you know, or the state 40R district, smart growth concept. You know, we can define what the, you know, the relative percentages of commercial to residential could be. There needs to be a variance mechanism within that, because what'll happen, and what we saw in Grafton and I've seen at other locations, is that the commercial sometimes prevents the residential, you know, the affordable housing or something like that from being built. They walk hand in hand. If you have too much commercial and it ends up being vacant space because you dictate it in the zoning bylaw, then the residences don't get occupied and the whole thing fails. So you have to have an understanding of where the market is today, you know, on any of these projects. You can build, and I'm sure we can build that flexibility in.
So I'd love to hear from other folks on the RFP committee if you have any other questions, either for the EDC, for the board, or anything from that perspective. And while you're reflecting on that, are there any other linkages that we have, or dependencies that we have between the EDC and the RFP committee? I know you guys have to do your standards. The EDC needs that to work with the planning board to do the zoning. Are there other things that we need to clarify in terms of who's engaging with the planning board to bring them the zoning? It sounds like that would be the EDC. So they'll work with the planning boards. You guys will focus on the RFP and initially the standards. Anything else that we need to be thinking about? Other questions or comments from our new friends on the RFP committee?
I told them they're not allowed to talk.
They're not allowed to talk. Yeah, that's what you voted for me for chairman. No talking.
I think design standards is going to be a chore, and it probably needs to be done in the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah.
Because although town meeting is November 5th,
yeah,
we really need to be done by the end of September. So we can go to KP and we can go to planning and have hearings and allow people to have any input to actually modify that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And you know, for a committee that's been in existence for 7 days,
it's a lot.
I mean, I think we're all committed to working on that, but that's going to be a push. Yeah.
And what kinds of things will the EDC be doing in the run-up to the town meeting? Or what can we do to help in the run-up to the town meeting to start to build some of that?
So one of the things that really, there's a kind of a crossroads in decision-making, involves the planning board, but it also involves the Board of Selectmen and potentially the state. And that's, if we choose to go with a smart growth district, 40R, where we're encouraging state incentives, you know, where we make ourselves eligible for state incentives and get a bonus payment right away upon implementation of the zone, then there's a lot of work in educating both the selectmen, the planning board, other committees as to what 40R really means. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not that simple. Yeah. And so what we're considering doing is the EDC is potentially hire a consultant to come in and present that to the selectmen, to the planning, you know, present 40R to
it almost makes me wonder, and again, this is like, how much do you try to explain in a town meeting versus having a workshop beforehand or something like that, right? 'Cause it's almost like you'd want to go and say, let the town meeting decide 40R versus not 40R, right? Because we'll have an opinion, but really you got to get it through town meeting. So it's almost like you'd want to say, okay, we've got, like we did with the marijuana zoning, right? Like you've got option A, you've got option B, pros, cons, we're going to take a vote. And sort of that same kind of scenario it's feeling like, because again, we'll have an opinion, but it doesn't matter what we think.
Right, I think that's exactly correct. And then, you know, we need to do a good enough job on explaining the advantages of either one.
Yeah, and a consulting firm could help you build all that content and.
Right.
Cool.
I actually did a little reading on the 40R. It was great, I think, website that the state has put together with 3 big projects that were done One was in Northampton, one was in Haverhill, and the other one was in Reading. They're relatively large tracts of land. That was the only thing I saw in that when I was doing this little studying, was that they were, I'm thinking that we're leveraging too small a parcel to do a 40R, but I'm not sure about that. But again, Northampton was 16 acres, Haverhill was 53 acres, and Reading was 26 acres. So they were big. One was an old state hospital. So they're big tracts of land that they're repurposing.
The one we did in Grafton is, basically a building envelope of about 6 acres.
6 acres?
Yeah, but it was 240 housing units in 6 acres. So the initial incentive payment was $350,000 that was paid upon implementation of the zone. When the building permits are issued, it's another $350,000. And then there's a payment that's made under 40S that for all of the school expenses. So it can be applicable to relatively small areas. The question will be, again, what's the zone? Where does the zone, if the 40R zone extends the whole, where we were talking about the overlay, it affects all of those. So every time a residential housing unit gets built, the town gets a credit for it. And the same thing is true of the commercial space.
Was that parcel in Grafton bare vacant land, or did it have a?
It was a 300,000 square foot mill that burned down, that we remediated.
Okay. Anything else regarding zoning, or shall we move on to get zoning covered pretty good? I was thinking maybe we could have Derek speak a little bit about the RFP process, maybe the timeline of it. I think we've kind of beat that up a little bit, but if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to the process that the town needs to follow. And we had this conversation last week with the RFP committee, and I think it was enlightening to some folks who've never gone through a public process like that, all the different hurdles and milestones that we have to meet. So once the RFP is developed, and I think we've talked a lot about that so far this evening, we were talking a little bit about how long do we want to advertise this RFP for. So is it going to be 30 days? Is it going to be 60 days? We'll probably lean more towards a 60-day marker, only given the fact that this is going to be a very complex application to respond to. And so in my experience in the past, when you issue 30 days, unless it's a construction project that you're repairing a roof or something, you try to give potential firms more time. What's happened to me in the past is we've done a 30-day notice, and then we didn't get the responses we were looking for, and then we call up all the vendors, why didn't you respond? And they say I didn't have enough time. So having a 60-day window will probably give some of these potential developers more time. So after we go through that process, we receive the applications, and it'll be up to this committee to review those applications. And so one other piece we want to be very clear about is these developers will submit two what I call envelopes. One envelope will be all the technical information. It'll describe the development project they're proposing, the architecture, the commercial makeup versus the residential makeup. And so that's really what this committee is going to rank these developers on based upon their proposal. They will not have an opportunity to look at any costs associated with that. It's strictly what their proposal. So they'll do what is called a comparative analysis. So during that RFP development process, they'll have to identify what they would rank these developers as advantageous, highly advantageous, or not advantageous at all. And so we'll spend time thinking about that. Do we think a developer who has 20 years experience is most advantageous versus a developer who has 10 years experience? So that's the type of criteria that the committee will be looking for. So they'll do a review of the submittal, and then in all likelihood you'll bring back anywhere from 2 to 5 potential developers to do a presentation. And then after the presentation is over, they'll rank one the most highly advantageous. And it's at that time they can open up the second envelope and see what the cost proposal is. And so when I say cost, it's really, we have 2 parcels that we're putting out to bid. We have the church and we have the parking lot that we're putting up to bid. So how much of those developers are willing to pay
in conjunction with their development proposal to the town, then they'll finally decide whether or not that proposal is they want to advance to the Board of Selectmen for a final endorsement. So it's a quite lengthy process. It's very complex. We'd have to advertise it through the Central Register. We have to advertise it through combines. We have to advertise in the local newspaper. So again, there's a lot of different criteria we have to meet to go through this procurement process.
What are the implications, or how does the fact that any development on those two parcels includes two privately owned parcels? How does that play into the RFP process?
So, for obvious reasons, we can't bid those parcels out because they're privately owned. One idea we talked a little bit about was working with the property owners and using their parcel information and a sale price as one of the appendices in the RFP. So one thing developers are going to want to know, in order to acquire these 4 parcels, what are my total costs, right? And so although we can't speak on behalf of the private developer, we can certainly include their information as a potential cost. So if we were to give the award to an ABC developer, they would know, at least in my opinion, right up front what the cost is going to be to go ahead to acquire those, to work directly, excluding town government, to work directly with the private property owner to acquire those 2 parcels of land. And so having talked to that family, I think they're willing to work with us on publicizing the cost, the sale price for those 2 parcels. And so I would propose that we put that in the proposal itself.
All right. And certainly, we think that would streamline the process, and certainly that's a key piece of information any developers would want to know. So.
And and there's been a number of developers who have come to town hall because they've heard about the work that the EDC had been spearheading this past spring. Even prior to that, they heard that the town had acquired the church, and so just having cursory conversations with them, they say it's very simple. A lot of them have spreadsheets, and they put the costs that are associated with acquiring the land, any construction costs, any environmental remediation that has to get conducted on those parcels, and then they look at what the cost would be to build it out and the revenues they could generate from it. And at the end, it tells you at the bottom of that spreadsheet whether or not it's a worthwhile venture. And so the ones that I've talked to have all said that they would do that. They would. And so in order to get a good understanding of whether or not this development project is going to work for them, they're going to want to know what the sale price will be for those other 2 parcels.
Is there any risk in publicizing that, right? Because essentially then the private landowners, I assume they have to put those on the market, or they don't have to put them on the right. It's like, is there any risk of someone swooping in and saying, oh, look, the town's trying to do something with this land, I'm going to go buy these from the private owners now and hope for the best, or is that not? That's not.
That would be entirely up to those.
Right, you're trusting in the process. So.
Right, and the family to hold it, knowing that there's going to be a bigger development project.
Derek, does the town have any leverage on the 2 parcels, the Thompson parcels, with a developer to meet our vision and to meet our design standards? We don't have any leverage, do we?
Though our design standards would be written in the RFP. They would have to meet that criteria.
Suppose they buy the land and they have their own vision of what they want to do, and they do that. We can't make them.
That's where the
Zoning
zoning
will
comes
control
in.
it.
I know,
So that's where the zoning comes in.
oh,
The zoning's in place, that has the design.
well, they can conform to zoning, but not conform to the vision.
The town would not sell their 2 parcels unless the developer met the design standards.
Right, that's the only
So-
leverage we have of those
right.
2 parcels.
Exactly, those 2 parcels, right. Because those are as you know, those are the 2 parcels we control. So the other 2 parcels are privately held, but having talked to that property owner, they're willing to work with the town because they recognize how important this is to the town to try to knit these 4 parcels together for one project.
So the town also owns where the playground is,
Right.
but that's not included in,
Not in today's RFP, no. The focus on
Yeah.
just those 4 parcels
that's
that
the
went to town
focus,
meeting.
but is a way of leveraging the vision.
Well, I think to Dave's point, he mentioned earlier that, you know, the developer who was the successful awardee would, and I think all of us would agree, would have a leg up on any other development project because they've already proven success. They've already proven that they're able to meet our standards. So if the town were to issue another RFP, say for the playground property, that developer certainly has a track record of success and would be, I think, the most advantageous developer to work with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point though, Steve, assuming this is the point you're making, which is why not include that parcel in this process as we're creating an RFP and have these design standards and we're holding someone accountable. So why wouldn't you include that to make it more appealing to a potential investor to say, I've got more to work with? Is that sort of what you're
Yeah,
saying?
you think it's too big of a reach to include that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, my 2 cents, I don't want to answer for Gene or Dave, but my sense is that, you know, the more complex it becomes, the harder it is to get anything done. So I think the notion is, let's start small but think big,
Okay.
right? So let's start with these 2 parcels that we control. If we can get something done there, great. We know we've got this next parcel that if we make it part of the overlay, a developer knows we've got this overlay. They know, they're not fools. They're going to know, like, hey, this is the next target parcel that we could potentially do something with. You know, now or later, we don't know. But to try to include it now, I think it adds complexity to an already challenging process.
And I would just add to that town meeting has only given the Board of Selectmen authority to sell the church property and the parking lot. So
Yeah.
you have to go to town meeting to seek that authority to sell any municipally owned property, and so we haven't received that for the other parcels.
Right, right, and that would look like a breach of trust. We wouldn't want to include that when we don't have permission from the taxpayer.
Yeah.
And then therefore, you know,
Yeah.
when we went to town meeting, I think it was last November, we had quite a bit of trouble. We ended up having to pass over articles
Yeah, I'm aware that that
regarding
is
this.
the case.
Yeah.
Regarding this very same issue, so. I guess one last question for Derek. I mean, is there any way that we can kind of get any sort of a read, how many responses we would expect to see? Or is that just strictly?
Kelly had a great idea. Maybe Kelly can talk a little bit about doing an RFQ to try to measure the temperature of the water.
Yeah, so one of the other things that we had talked about was potentially doing a walkthrough of the property in the fall or in the late summer, as opposed to doing that in January when it's maybe not as attractive. So we had talked about potentially issuing an RFQ sooner so that it's letting potential developers know that the project is coming. We could spell out the timeline for when we're expecting to issue the RFP, exactly when it would be expected to be returned, so they know they have 60 days from the state to the state to figure out their costs, figure out their approach, whatever it is. And from that, we could definitely get a sense of what the interest would be, whether it's 5 developers, 20 developers, whatever it is. But that would definitely help inform us a little bit earlier.
Okay.
And
It's a good thing.
And one thing that was brought up is that would give us more information and more ideas to put into the RFP as well.
Yeah, that's a great
So
idea.
it's almost like a fact-finding mission. to a certain
Right, because I think it's
Right.
that big unknown, and even Steve, to your point, right, like, is this even viable economically at all, even with these 4 parcels? Once we put our design standards onto it and we have our zoning overlay, like, is there value there? So I think an RFQ can start to formally open up some of those conversations and dialogue with developers sooner rather than later, which I think is a good thing. It's great. Good idea.
Right, right. And if, I don't think that, we want to make sure we're successful, so we really don't need it to be a foot race to try to get an RFP out as quickly as we can. So I think a little bit of extra time may be helpful. It's almost like marketing.
At the RFQ stage, it's really about the developer. It's not about us at that point. It's not about our project. It's about who's qualified, why are they qualified, who's the team they're going to present, and are they really interested in this project. At the RFP stage, that's when it's about us. So how much value can they actually bring to this town? So the developer should be able to turn around an RFQ relatively quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. All right. Is there anything else? Any other questions? Have we covered pretty much everything? Is there anything anybody would like to comment on before we move on?
It's partly your idea, Michelle. What do you think? we accomplished what you wanted?
Yes,
Good,
yes, it's great, thank you.
of course.
One thing that could screw some of this up a little bit is the status of Grove Street. We don't know what's gonna happen with Grove Street, whether it gets changed, realigned, whether or not. So in the process of creating an RFP, I would hope that we can be sensitive to the fact that if Grove Street were to change, we don't want to eliminate any, I mean, in the vision, there's a building sitting on Grove Street. And we don't want to lose that opportunity to have another building in the center if in fact we come up with a way, working with the state DOT, to realign Grove Street, should that be the decision that the town wants to make. So what we have to try to do is figure out a way to create an RFP that wouldn't prevent that from happening. And if it did happen, could take advantage, a developer could take advantage of that.
I think if that were to happen, myself, I think that would be a very lengthy process. So in my mind, I'd say this process should already be underway. Let's just say the properties are already being developed, and let's just say hypothetically that the state were to come through. It's a very expensive project. I mean, I think Derek's estimate at our last meeting was $4.6 million. I don't think there's any way that the town of Upton can afford that project.
Why not, right?
Period.
Right.
I mean, I'm certainly not in favor of spending that kind of money because you're just not leveraging a lot of land. You're basically trading, maybe a quarter or a third of an acre for another third to a half of an acre. You're just not moving the needle a lot there, in my opinion. But again, if the state were to come through and think it was a good idea and we were able to do that, I think again, then you get the next RFP process, which would be that parcel of land that you created. And again, whoever your successful winning bidder, I would think, would be the clear-cut, buyer for that property.
Are there any examples that you can conceive of what would be in an RFP that would prevent a developer from taking advantage of that rerouting?
Well, like I said, the vision shows a building sitting right on where Grove Street currently is.
Right.
So how close the adjacent building might be to the street is important. So if you, I don't know exactly what might prevent that from happening, but it's just something that I think the RFP committee should just keep in mind when they're doing this, is if in fact we can reroute Grove Street, it opens up a lot more possibility to the center for building and parking than if we don't. So, and again, it clearly depends on whether the state would be willing to help the town fund it.
We can very clearly issue alternates in the RFP as well. We can say, this is our baseline RFP, these are the parcels we're talking about. However, give us an alternate scenario for if we did reroute Grove Street. Give us an alternate scenario if you did get the parking lot behind the church. Like, there are different scenarios that we could propose to them as well.
We just want to be careful that a builder does not build down and turning the corner on Grove Street, because then you're going to have part of the building that's facing the road.
Mm-hmm.
But then if the road goes away,
Yeah.
how do they account for that? So.
Sounds like a challenge.
Eric, do you know if the owners of 6 Main Street are actively looking to sell that property?
6 Main Street,
The
the
old
board voted
dilapidated-
the board voted at the last meeting to execute a purchase and sale agreement to acquire that property.
So there's willing sellers.
We just signed a P&S.
Yeah.
A willing seller and a willing buyer, yes.
Yeah, we'll have a warrant article for November.
Yeah, it's contingent on passing at the November town meeting.
Right. And the other
Makes
thing,
sense.
I guess my last thoughts on Grove Street is, there is a brook that runs right next to the town hall here, and that brook runs underneath 140. So I'll also look at that, and I know we had a little issue with it when the municipal parking lot was being constructed. But if that is running underneath the road, I'm not sure what type of a issue that would be if you were trying to build something, let's just say, what is now the middle of Grove Street. So if right now it's the middle of Grove Street, if there's water running under that, that's an actual brook, you know, or a stream or whatever. I kind of think to myself, yeah, I'm sure it can be done. I mean, cubic dollars can fix a lot of things, but I'm just not sure that it's, you know, it's feasible. Again, I'm sure you could dig deeper and run a pump and all these other different things to give you the adequate clearance to build a foundation, you know, dig a foundation, but I'm not sure that that would, to me, I look at that and I say, you know, that's kind of a hindrance, the way that water runs under there. But,
One of the things that we all have to recognize, we don't have to solve every problem. That's why we're getting the private sector involved.
right, right. So, all right. Was there anything else? Anything else anybody would like to add?
So will we be including a discussion about or any information about the Thompson property in the RFP as well as 6 Main Street, or will we just leave that out because the town doesn't own those properties?
I think, Craig, what we want to do, the intention would be to work with the Thompson properties and to try to include those parcels in the sale price of those 2 parcels as an appendix within our RFP. Again, so the developer truly understands all the costs associated with bringing these 4 parcels together.
Mm-hmm. And would we include 6 Main Street as well, or just should we?
I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah.
Just because it's not contiguous, right? So I think that would,
Right. I mean, there's a couple of things. One, we don't own it yet,
Mhm.
so we have to go to town meeting to get that. And 2, even if we did own it, we haven't sought authority yet to sell that property. So, and to Selectmen Simon's point, it's not a contiguous property anyway, so it's probably off for all those reasons above.
Right. And I mean, from the town standpoint, from the board standpoint, we would be buying that property to demolish it. So in the short run, it does add to the footprint of the Racine building, which is nice. You know, being that it's pretty tight quarters over there, so that's helpful. So, all right. Very good. If there's no further discussion, the Board of Selectmen is going to move on then to Article 4.0. If we have a couple of other discussion items we have to take care of.
Thank you very much.
thank you very much. Awesome.
Thank you for
discussion.
attending, folks. Nice to meet all of you.
Now back to your normal summer fun. That this wasn't on your list of fun. It was air conditioned, right? Exactly. It's not as humid in here as it was outside.
All right.
See you, Steve. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. All right, so discussion item 4.1, execute a statement of claim for 92 Hopkinton Road. This is in regard to some dollars that are owed the town regarding this property that currently is vacant. So any discussion on that?
I think it's time. No?
All right,
No
if not,
discussion.
I will take a motion, or
I make a motion that we execute the statement of claim on 92 Hopkinton Road.
and it is for the sum of,
$18,126.19.
okay. I second the motion. I guess that would be majority action. And we'll sign this after the meeting, yep. Okay, great. On to discussion item 4.2, the Red Rock Road Race. We have an application in hand. They've been doing this for the last couple of years, I believe. Yeah, several years. The date is August 10th. It's a road race and a bicycle race as well. Any discussion on that? Any questions?
No, it's been great the past several years, and hope they keep it up. I know they raise a bunch of money, so that's great.
Yep, great. I will take a motion.
I make a motion to approve the Red Rock application for a road race on
Middle of the page, August 10th.
August 10th from 9 to 11:30.
I second the motion. Make that majority action. And also, we need to open the warrant for the fall special town meeting. The dates will be August 1st through September 13th. Amazing, time is flying
I'm
by.
just rushing. It's crazy.
I was listening to that. So,
Yeah, so I make a motion that we open the town warrant, or the warrant for the fall special town meeting from August 1st through September 13th.
I second the motion, make that majority action. And again, we are stepping, we're passing over discussion item 4.4. All right. So I will make a motion that we adjourn the meeting.
Second.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Great.
Thank you.